Here's a question most people never even think to ask. What do the world's biggest fortunes actually have in common? Not the businesses themselves, but the structure behind them? The answer, almost every single time, is a holding company. Not a single business, not one product. A structure, a parent company that owns pieces of other companies, assets, and investments underneath it. And understanding this one concept is often the difference between building one successful business and building an empire that keeps compounding for decades. Today, we're breaking down exactly how a holding company is built from literally zero to a structure worth $500 million or more. We'll cover what a holding company actually is and why it's different from a regular business, the exact stages of building one from your first business to your first acquisition, how the ownership structure actually works underneath the surface, the real risks and mistakes that derail people at every stage, and what it realistically takes in terms of time and capital to get there. If business structuring and wealth building topics like this are useful to you, make sure you're subscribed to Tom Explain Money. We go deep on exactly this kind of content every week. Let's build this thing from the ground up. What a holding company actually is. Let's start with the basics, because this term gets thrown around a lot without being properly explained. A holding company is a business entity that doesn't necessarily sell products or services itself. Instead, its main function is to own shares in other companies, real estate, intellectual property, or investment assets. Those companies underneath it are called subsidiaries, and they're the ones that actually operate, sell, and generate day-to-day revenue. Think of it like a tree. The holding company is the trunk. Each subsidiary is a branch, a separate business, often in a completely different industry, but all connected back to and controlled by the same central structure. Why does this matter so much? Because a holding company gives you three things a single business never can. 1. Risk isolation. If one subsidiary gets sued or fails financially, the holding company and the other subsidiaries are typically protected, because each one is a separate legal entity. 2. Centralized control. One small team at the top can control an enormous number of businesses underneath, without needing to run the daily operations of each one. 3. Capital efficiency. Profits from one subsidiary can be used to fund, acquire, or support another, all within the same overall structure, often with tax advantages depending on how it's set up. This is exactly the model used by some of the largest conglomerates in the world, a small holding entity at the top, with dozens or even hundreds of operating businesses underneath. Stage 1. Building your first business. Nobody starts by building a holding company. Every single one of them starts with one business, often a small, unremarkable one. At this stage, the goal isn't the holding structure at all. The goal is simple: build one profitable, cash flow generating business. This might be a service business, a small manufacturing operation, an agency, or a niche e-commerce brand. The specific industry matters far less than the underlying financial habits you build here. The critical habit at this stage is reinvestment. Most people, once a business starts generating profit, immediately increase their personal spending. The people who eventually build large holding structures do the opposite. They keep their personal lifestyle modest and reinvest aggressively back into the business or into buying the next one. This stage is also where you learn the fundamentals that everything else depends on: how to read a balance sheet, how to manage cash flow, how to negotiate with suppliers and partners, and critically, how to build a business that can eventually run without you personally doing everything. That last point is often the most overlooked. A business that depends entirely on the founder's daily involvement is very hard to fold into a larger holding structure later, because it can't operate independently. The businesses that get absorbed into successful holding companies are almost always ones with systems, processes, and a management layer, not just the founder doing everything themselves. If this kind of structural breakdown is useful, this is a great time to hit subscribe, so you don't miss the next parts of this series. Stage 2. Formalizing the structure. Once the first business is stable and profitable, the next stage is where the actual holding company gets created, often much earlier than people expect, sometimes even before a second business exists. Here's the basic mechanic. Instead of owning your operating business directly in your own name, you create a separate holding entity, and that entity owns the shares of your operating business. You personally then own shares of the holding company, not the operating business directly. Why set this up before you even have a second business? Because it's far easier to build this structure early and grow into it, than to retroactively restructure a large, complicated business later. Once profits, assets, and legal history accumulate inside one messy entity, separating them cleanly becomes expensive and complicated. At this stage, a few things typically happen. The first operating business becomes a subsidiary of the new holding company. Profits generated by the subsidiary can be moved up to the holding company, often with more favorable tax treatment than moving that money directly to a personal account. This retained capital, sitting inside the holding company, becomes the war chest for the next stage, acquiring or building additional businesses. It's worth being clear here how exactly profits move between a subsidiary and a holding company, and what tax treatment applies, depends heavily on jurisdiction, and should always involve a real accountant and lawyer. This video is explaining the structural concept, not personalized legal or tax advice. Stage 3. Acquiring or building the second business. This is where the real compounding begins, and where most people's holding company journey either accelerates or stalls completely. There are generally two paths to growing beyond the first business. Path 1. Building a second business from scratch, using the capital and experience generated by the first. This is slower, but it means starting with full ownership and a clean structure from day one. Path 2. Acquiring an existing business. This is often faster, and is the path most large holding companies eventually rely on heavily. Instead of starting from zero, you buy a business that's already profitable, often a small, undervalued company with an owner who's ready to retire or exit, sometimes referred to as a boring business that generates reliable cash flow without needing to be exciting or trendy. Acquisition financing typically comes from a mix of sources: retained profits, sitting inside the holding company; seller financing, where the previous owner agrees to be paid over time, out of future profit; and in some cases, bank loans secured against the acquired business's own assets and cash flow, rather than the buyer's personal finances. This is a critical point that surprises a lot of people. You often don't need $500 million, or even $5 million, of your own cash to acquire a $5 million business. With the right structure, a well-negotiated deal, and a business with strong existing cash flow, the acquisition can largely pay for itself over time. Once the second business is acquired, it becomes another subsidiary under the same holding company, sitting alongside the first, contributing its own profits upward, completely legally separate in terms of liability, but centrally controlled from the top. Stage 4. Scaling through repeated acquisition. Once the pattern from Stage 3 works once, it becomes repeatable, and this is where a holding company starts to genuinely compound. Each new acquisition typically gets easier for a few reasons. The holding company itself now has a track record, making it easier to secure financing on favorable terms. Retained profits across multiple subsidiaries create a larger pool of capital to fund the next deal, and the management team at the holding level gains more experience evaluating, negotiating, and integrating new businesses. A pattern that shows up again and again at this stage is diversification across industries. Rather than only acquiring businesses in one sector, many holding companies deliberately spread across different, often unrelated industries: a service business, a manufacturing company, a logistics operation. This isn't random. It protects the overall structure if any single industry goes through a downturn. This is also the stage where a small central team becomes essential. At $10 to $20 million in combined subsidiary revenue, one person can no longer personally oversee every business. A lean team, often just a handful of people handling finance, legal, and operational oversight, starts managing the portfolio of subsidiaries, while local managers run the day-to-day of each individual business. By the time a holding company reaches somewhere in the range of $50 to $100 million in overall value, the structure typically looks like this: multiple subsidiaries, each professionally managed and largely independent day-to-day, a lean central team overseeing capital allocation and major decisions, and a clear system for how profits move between subsidiaries and the parent company. Stage 5. Reaching the $500 million level. Getting from $100 million to $500 million in overall structure value usually involves a shift in how growth happens, not just how much. Larger acquisitions become the norm. Instead of buying small, single-owner businesses, the holding company starts acquiring larger, more established companies, sometimes ones with their own existing management teams, and even their own smaller subsidiaries. Access to capital changes fundamentally at this stage. With a substantial track record and asset base, holding companies at this size typically gain access to larger credit facilities, institutional lenders, and in some cases, outside investors who want to co-invest in specific acquisitions or take a minority stake in the holding company itself. Professional governance becomes essential. At this scale, informal decision-making doesn't work anymore. Most holding companies at this level have a formal board, clear reporting structures from each subsidiary, and standardized financial systems that allow leadership to see performance across the entire portfolio at a glance. The role of the original founder often changes significantly. Rather than running individual businesses, or even actively negotiating every deal, the founder's role shifts toward capital allocation, deciding which industries to expand into, which subsidiaries to double down on, and which underperforming pieces to sell off. It's worth being honest about timelines here. Very few holding companies reach $500 million in under a decade. Most realistic paths take somewhere between 15 and 25 years of consistent reinvestment, acquisition, and disciplined capital allocation. This is a long-term compounding game, not a fast one. Common mistakes that derail this process. Before we close out, it's worth covering the mistakes that most commonly stop people from ever getting past the first or second stage. 1. Personal lifestyle inflation. The single most common failure point is simple. As the first business becomes profitable, personal spending increases instead of reinvestment, and the capital needed to fund the next stage never accumulates. 2. Overconcentration in one industry. Some holding companies stay entirely within one sector, which feels safer initially, but removes the diversification benefit that protects larger structures during downturns. 3. Acquiring businesses that depend entirely on their previous owner. If a business can't run without its founder, absorbing it into a holding structure often just creates a management headache rather than a genuine asset. 4. Underestimating integration costs. Buying a business is one thing, successfully integrating its systems, culture, and reporting into the broader holding structure is a completely different, often underestimated challenge. 5. Growing the structure faster than the management team can handle. Acquiring businesses faster than you can properly oversee them often leads to problems being discovered far too late, sometimes after significant value has already been lost. So, building a holding company, $0 to $500 million, isn't really a single business story. It's a structural story, one business, formalized into a holding structure, that grows through disciplined reinvestment, smart acquisitions, and increasingly professional management over what's usually a 15 to 25-year journey. The core lesson underneath all of it is this: it's rarely about having one great idea. It's about building a structure that lets you keep compounding good decisions over and over for decades. If this breakdown was useful, hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Tom Explain Money. We cover exactly this kind of business and wealth structuring content every week. Drop a comment below. Would you rather build one large business or a portfolio of smaller ones under a holding structure? Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.